Hi everybody. Thank you for coming to this week's seminar despite the heavy snow outside. It's good to see you as always. So today we have Dr. Billy Sperlich visiting from Germany. So Dr. Billy received his diploma in exercise science from the German Sport University, Cologne. Is it correct?
Yeah, totally.
In 2002. He then fast-tracked into a PhD degree at the same university and studied cardiology and training science. After receiving his PhD degree in 2007, he served as researcher and lecturer in several institutes within the German Sport University in Cologne until 2010. In 2013, he is employed as a professor at the University of Würzburg and is currently the head of the Integrative and Experimental Exercise Science and Training Group, short form as INTEX. In research, Dr. Sperlich is interested in the various stimuli and recovery procedures that can enhance function and adaptations in various populations. One of his recent studies looked into the effect of mesocycles with different training intensity distributions in 42 recreational runners. So mesocycle is a training phase in a training plan that contains usually 3 to 6 microcycles. Now you may wonder what is meso and microcycles. The microcycles is generally up to 7 days, while the mesocycle is typically a month. Is that correct?
Or longer.
Or longer. Considering the scale of the study in terms of the number of subjects and training time involved, Dr. Sperlich is very happy that he can now share the findings of this work in the Medicine of Science in Sports and Exercise journal that was recently published. In his free time, Dr. Sperlich loves skiing, running, and mountain biking. He particularly enjoys the crunching sound of the snow and the gravels while doing these sports. I'm glad that he's in Calgary, as the Rocky Mountains nearby can definitely offer him such pressure. Before our mind drift into the mountains, let's welcome Dr. Sperlich to give his talk entitled High-Intensity Interval Training, Benefits, Drawbacks, and the Future Applications. Please.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Today, it's a great honor for me to present a lot of my work I've done in my laboratory on this special topic. In about 4 to 5 slides, I will explain my motivation behind high-intensity interval training. Currently, high-intensity interval training, if you look on a PubMed database and you type in the words high-intensity interval training, you will find a lot of data. In 2017, about 250 articles were published with exactly that search term. So there's actually an exponential increase in knowledge around this topic. This is probably why the ACSM has discovered high-intensity interval training as the #1 trend in the fitness area. And if you look at social media and you type in hashtag HIIT as high-intensity interval training, you will find about 400 hits just on that topic. If all these pictures are totally related to high-intensity interval training, I don't know, but at least there seems to be a popular interest in this type of exercise. Well, as you might know, I kind of have to bring this picture. I'll end my presentation with a little different slide. So the big question is, why are you so strong? So the very quick answer is, it's just a matter of hitting it hard. And yeah, that's a little bit the introduction to my topic today. So I'd like to give you my definition of what I refer to high-intensity interval training. The term high-intensity interval training is currently not really defined, so I think we need some sort of a basis. Then I'd like to give you an overview on short-term interventions lasting about 2 to 9 weeks on high-intensity interval training, which I believe explain a lot of the mechanisms involved in high-intensity interval training. Then a current area I've been going into are long-term strategies, adding high-intensity interval training to different type of endurance exercises. and my current thoughts and maybe some future directions or some future areas of interest. This is a very simple intensity model. If you look in textbooks on how to define intensity, this is one way. You might have done an incremental testing on a treadmill, and what you will experience is when you run, you will have a certain intensity which you probably will perceive as moderate, higher intensity zone as intense, and at the end of an incremental testing you will feel this intensity as very intense. If you look at some physiological, let's say, variables, and you can calculate benchmarks, giving you some information on the physiology involved in this incremental testing, and you have special benchmarks. I won't go into detail here, but this allows us to define certain intensity zones. If you buy a sports watch nowadays, you can basically you can implement these zones either by an algorithm provided by the sports watch, or you predefine your intensity zones based on your physiology. So I will call this moderate intensity zone, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. Some textbooks define 5 zones or even 7 zones. It depends on cycling, running, swimming, whatever you want to do. So I'll keep it simple today. We'll use a 3-zone model. And if you then look at a certain period of training, this zone model allows you to basically define the way you exercise. So if you want to do more moderate intensity exercise, you'd invest a lot more time in zone 1, not so much time in zone 2 or 3. And on the other side, if you want to do a more emphasis on high intensity interval training, you'll invest more time in zone 3. So this is the area I'll focus on the next minutes. So if we define high intensity, this is a little bit of a busy chart. Let me guide you through. So we have the zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3 here. And we have another different benchmarks. So this would be an intensity close to your lactate threshold intensity, so a more or less moderate intensity. And everything below this intensity, it's called low intensity exercise. Some call it MICE, moderate intensity continuous exercise, or high volume low intensity exercise. This type of exercise, basically, I don't want to say you can do forever, but you can do it for a long period of time, and it's usually performed continuously. Then a different form, or training with a higher intensity, so-called threshold exercise, is within zone 2. It's between your velocity at peak heart rate or peak oxygen uptake, and it's above your lactate threshold running intensity. This is a type of intensity, depending on how fit you are, on your physiology, that's something you can do, let's say 20 to 60 minutes on a continuous basis. And getting closer to your maximum oxygen uptake, that's a range you probably could do if you'd set the speed there, maybe 1 to 8 minutes, maybe 12 minutes, 16 minutes. That's why this black arrow indicates a little bit of a variance in between. So in above, of course you can go above your running speed at peak oxygen uptake. You then need to do a shorter bout with a certain time of recovery in between. That depends on the duration of the interval and your work to rest ratio. So please don't take these numbers totally seriously. This is just for me, just a kind of a number to give you an idea on how to define maybe high intensity interval training. You can do shorter bouts. Then of course, if you look at the running speed, you'd be a little bit higher, and you can go on until you're up close to your maximum. Of course, you cannot repeat that 10, 15, 20 times, so you have a very short amount of intervals close to your maximum running speed. So everything in this area I would call as high intensity. Everything repeatedly I would define as high intensity interval training, closer to your maximum running speed. This some studies call this type of high intensity interval training repeated sprinting, or in some areas sprint interval training. So this is just to give you a slight overview on what in the next slides I will recall as high intensity interval training. To give you some ideas, this is the model I just showed you. I will show you some examples on how high intensity interval training can look like. This is your typical, probably you know, Wingate testing. It's usually performed 30 seconds full speed. This is in my old lab studies we did either 1 time Wingate testing or up to 5 times, which is very strenuous, and of course you need a certain time in between the intervals to recover. And this area, in this intensity area, this could be a type of interval training we do repeatedly. In this model here, it's multi-directional with contact plates measuring the time in between the plates. Or what we've done is a model arm and leg exercise intervals. In this case, I think it was 8 times 1 minute intervals, just adding another another muscle group to the exercise. And a form of exercise we've been going into is very short, brief intervals, and how basically, especially cognitive function influences or is influenced by high intensity interval training at the workplace. So this is more in this area, 4 to 6 minutes of high intensity interval training. So yeah, this is just to give you an overview. I believe there's, in the terminology of high intensity interval training, there's a different term. It's called HIIT, H-I-T. This is more related to strength exercise. It's a special form of strength training related more to protein synthesis. So I believe we need to distinguish between HIIT and HIT. So the one's more strength related, it's more connected to bodybuilding, and the other one's more connected to endurance type of exercise. So if we come back to this chart, I will focus on more on the endurance exercises. So to give you an overview on short-term intervention, I need to do a little bit of a bypass, because I think I need to explain to you a little bit my motivation in high-intensity interval training. This is a typical book I'd say probably every sports student in Germany will read. A lot of coaches read this book. The only issue with this book is there's one sentence that's been, at least in the 80s and 90s, influencing all coaches in the area, meaning that frequent, intense exercise kind of impairs your mitochondrial function. And this was the basis for let's say, an era of high volume, low intensity exercise, especially in Germany in the 80s and 90s. So it was basically not really allowed to perform high intensity interval training. Of course, nowadays, we know it's completely vice versa. We know high intensity interval training quite significantly stimulates mitochondrial function. And this has been, let's say, at least in as I was a coach, has influenced my work quite dramatically. So in 2006, I was quite intrigued by 2 major studies, and these 2 studies actually developed a lot of discussion among coaches, at least in Germany, and it's shifting a bit the view on how we should prescribe endurance exercise. So this is a study from Scandinavia, and basically what they compared was long, slow distance running and compared it to high-intensity interval exercise. This is an 8-week intervention, 3 times per week. The long, slow distance running consisted of about 70% of peak heart rate for 45 minutes versus 15 seconds on, 15 seconds recovery, repeated 47 times, or a 4x4 minute interval close to peak heart rate with 3 minutes of recovery. And the main outcome from that study was an increase in oxygen uptake of about 7%, which was directly closely linked to the cardiac output. So to a certain, let's say, cardiac dimension, which is very important for oxygen transport and oxygen delivery to the muscles. So I was quite intrigued at that time. Everyone was focusing on long, slow distance exercise and endurance sport, and all of a sudden we see a dramatic, different view to endurance exercise. And I was a swim coach at that time, and of course, if you invest a lot of swimming time, maybe there are different ways to maybe improve your endurance. So that was the beginning for our laboratory to go into that research. At the same time, a second study came out comparing 30-second, more or less supramaximal cycle sprints repeated 4 to 6 times with 4 minutes recovery, and compared that type of exercise to 2-hour continuous of exercise. Intervention duration there was not too long, was about 2 weeks roughly. But the interesting part was this group invested about 10.5 hours of exercise, whereas this group invested only 2 hours of exercise. And the adaptation, at least on muscle level, on cellular level, were quite similar in both groups. So this was, for me, the shift maybe to think more, definitely more on high-intensity interval training. So at that time I started to use my contacts as a swim coach, and we tried to design, or we designed a study focusing on or comparing this exercise to the more long, slow distance exercise. So I had a friend, a coach friend at that time. I was finishing my PhD studies at that time, and we were able to have a 27 participant large group at that time performing. And personally, I think I haven't read any crossover design, randomized and controlled study in this area. So this is why I'm presenting this data. So we were capable of performing a 5-week intervention before a summer break and the same intervention after the summer break. Basically what the kids did in this study was, these are the intervals within a 5-week period. So they performed a lot more, high-intensity group performed a lot more of shorter intervals and a lot more in the high-volume group, just the opposite. So the high-intensity group in the end had about 30 kilometers, and the high-volume training group about 60 kilometers of swimming invested during that time. Just to give you a very quick overview on the data, we collected a lot more, but for me the most striking were the LE endpoints. LE endpoints is, for those of you who are not into swimming, it's an international, it's kind of like a ranking system comparing your own performance to the world record times. So it's possible to basically compare 100-meter breaststroke with 100-meter freestyle, for example. And the LE endpoints dramatically increased only in the high-intensity interval group, whereas the increases in the high-volume exercise group were not as dramatic. And me as a coach and as an athlete, if you invest a lot of time into your exercise and the benefit is quite high, or the performance gains are quite high, this, from a motivational point of view, was for me the stimulus to say, okay, there are certain times, probably in a periodization model, where it's very important to apply high-intensity interval training. Of course, you wouldn't do that a whole year long. In Germany, after that study, of course, you need to replicate this data in soccer. It's very important, gives you a lot of reputation. Basically, we did the same story in soccer, the identical, more or less, study design. In this case, we also could replicate about 7% of increase in VO2 max, but for me the most striking and interesting part was the sprinting. If you look at high volume exercise and those young soccer players there, they did not become slower. That's something you sometimes read in textbooks, that by applying low intensity exercise over a certain period of time, these kids definitely, they even became faster on the sprinting distance, but probably only because we implemented a certain time of their exercise in soccer specific drills. Most probably you're more into the jumping biomechanics. If you do not apply jumping exercise, you won't see any differences in jumping pre and post, and that's why we didn't see any differences in the jumping performance, because we did not exercise jumping during that time. So we could replicate the data in soccer, and it worked in swimming, so we're quite sure on a time frame of about 2 to 9 weeks, the high intensity interval training. If you only have that time period, it's most probably the more promising strategy if compared to high volume exercise. What are the mechanisms? I do not want to go into detail, but the mechanisms from high volume training and high intensity training at a certain cellular level, the adaptation is quite similar. Mitochondrial biogenesis occurs, fat oxidation increases, glycogen metabolism increases, and on a more systemic level, or more on a central adaptation, the stroke volume or increasing cardiac output, those are probably the two main or strong mechanisms explaining why oxygen availability, oxygen transport increase with both with high intensity and high volume training, but only the cardiac side seems to be stimulated by high intensity interval training. And these adaptations also translate to the health area, and this is why high intensity interval training has begun to become a very popular exercise form in different patients, in different populations. You see increase in VO2 peak, you see decrease in systolic and diastolic blood pressure, everything related to metabolism. I'll go into this area, enjoyment of exercise. I'm not totally convinced that high intensity interval training increases enjoyment of exercise. Quality of life, yes, we've done studies in cancer patients. It seems to have a benefit there, but I'll come back to this enjoyment of exercise just in a minute. So everyone who's interested more in the health area, I refer to this article. Gives you kind of a good overview on HIIT versus high volume exercise. But I have to say, if you apply this type of exercise, in our lab, I usually I'd say 70% of our studies are with healthy, more young people. 70% about. And if they perform this type of exercise, I won't show you how this guy looks after the third or fourth repetition. Definitely what happens is a lot of our subjects report dizziness afterwards, nausea and vomiting. It's quite often, so I cannot recommend applying high intensity to everyone. It definitely depends on the motivation, on the type of subject you have and your target or the aim of what you want to achieve with your exercise. So definitely be aware of that. It's very popular currently, but I will not recommend it for everyone. These are some reasons why it may be inappropriate, because high-intensity interval training, you need a lot of motivation and confidence, high degree of self-regulation, and depending on a protocol, it's not necessarily time efficient, depending on the protocol you apply. If you take warm-up, cool-down, and all the recovery time in between intervals together, it might not necessarily be time efficient. And there are several contraindications to high-intensity interval training. If you're interested, please look up into this publication here. So my third topic is that's an area where we've been focusing on the last 3 to maybe 4 years, is our long-term strategies on how can you implement high-intensity interval training, maybe even if you also if you apply low-intensity volume exercise. So the study that basically stimulated me to do more research in this area was from Scandinavia, and basically what they did in this retrospective analysis of quite well-trained cross-country skiers, VO2 to max above 70 milliliters. They checked about 300 or close to 400 training sessions, and what they found out that about 75% of the training time, or in this case the sessions, the cross-country skiers invest in zone 1, not so much in zone 2. In zone 2, but significantly more training sessions in zone 3. So this group then called this type of training intensity distribution polarized training intensity distribution, just because you have a quite high amount of zone 1 training and quite high amount of zone 3 training retrospectively analyzed in these cross-country skiers. For us, it then was that was a good, let's say, kind of like a good kickoff to experimentally check if this is true, if you do a prospective experiment. And we wanted to know what happens if you take well-trained endurance athletes performing either high volume, low intensity exercise, emphasizing on high intensity exercise, doing a polarized intensity distribution, and as a, I'd say, as a control training scenario on threshold training focusing on zone 2. So we had 48 well-trained athletes, way above 60 milliliters of VO2 peak in different group and in different sports, cycling, running, and cross-country skiing. This was our experimental setup. So this group here, the high volume, low intensity group, trained this periodization, high intensity in this periodization, the polarized group this way, and high intensity group this way. We had a lot of data in that study. I'll just focus on one aspect, on the oxygen uptake, because it's quite good. It's not totally linked to performance, but is a strong indicator, at least for endurance athletes. So what was the effect? So if well-trained endurance athletes, I have to say they were not accustomed to high-intensity training before the study. That's an important information. If they perform threshold training, they actually reduce their VO2 peak. High volume intensity exercise basically gives them no really 2.6%. That's within the range of our measurement error. Low volume, high intensity exercise, that's the normal 5 to 7% you would expect, and the polarized group gave us about 12% of increase. So it kind of replicates the retrospective data of that Scandinavian group, and that was our motivation to look into the literature once more and see how very well trained or in the documentations you can find in the databases on how elite athletes exercise. And if you look on zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3 in different endurance disciplines like speed skaters, rowers, runners, cyclists, swimming, and so on, you have this, it's kind of like shaped like a pyramid intensity distribution. So you have a large proportion of zone 1 exercise, less in zone 2, and even more or less in zone 3. And you only have one data set on polarized intensity distribution. So we were quite curious, if this is the, let's say, best practice training intensity model in endurance athletes. That's why we were stimulated to launch a research topic in Frontiers in Physiology. We'll close submission, I think it's end of April. And we have a lot of very good articles coming out on comparing zone 1, zone 2, zone 3 in different endurance sports. Of course, you cannot compare training intensity distribution in runners to cyclists to rowers, because just from a biomechanical point of view, it's a total different muscle activation. And most probably they will have different training intensity distributions. So have a close look into that. I think it's a very nice research topic, which will be closed quite soon. One data from our lab or from our collaboration, it could be a message maybe in future if you go into the elite area. If you apply a polarized model, it has to be very polarized. It's not like I do 70-30. It has to be a really polarized, it has to be high volume, a lot of high volume, low intensity exercise, and a lot of high intensity exercise. And this is just data from our German rowers here. The more polarized they are, the higher they increase over time in the 2,000 meter rowing time. This could be, maybe if we look at other data, maybe we would need to retrospectively reanalyze some data sets and just look into those athletes who really showed a clear polarization in their training intensity distribution. As you can see here, this is an issue. Of course, in this type of settings, you prescribe exercise, but you have one issue. You don't totally know if coaches or athletes follow this prescription. And this is what happened, at least in this study here. Our study, this was the group performing more low intensity, high volume exercise. The closer they get to the first competition, the more intensity and the more polarized their actual training becomes. And if you do testing here and if you do testing here, basically the outcome of the study will most probably come from this part of the season and not so much from this part of the season. So that's an issue. So we would like to have more frequent measurements, but in top athletes, it's just basically, it's impossible. But be aware, if you analyze this type of training, there are variations in the training intensity distribution. So I was curious. This was our last study we did on training intensity distribution, and I wanted to know, can we apply this polarized model also to runners, especially to recreational runners in a range of about 45 milliliters, so they were not really trained. And so what we did is we had a 4-week wash-in phase, 2 to 4 sessions, our low intensity exercise. We then increased their load. This is a TRIMP. TRIMP is a model of training load, basically based on the time you spend based on heart rate. And we increased their training load by 150%. And one group performed high intensity exercise, low intensity exercise, and a polarized training intensity distribution. And after 3 weeks, we reduced the training load. We gave them a 1-week tapering phase, and we did another testing. The usual performance testing, peak oxygen uptake, velocity at lactate threshold, running economy, and 5K running performance. And as you can see here, based on increases over time, it's not statistically significant, but the high volume exercise in recreational runners seems to be the more optimal training scenario. I don't want to say they were beginners, but at least they were not really accustomed to a lot of running. If you look at individual responses from these 4 variables here, most probably, if you look at each individual, you have some non-responders or low responders here, the same here, and the same in the polarized group. And at least from our data, how we analyzed or interpret the data, I would say the relative risk of non-responding is greater with high and pole compared to the low intensity exercise. So this, if someone would ask me today on how to perform your training intensity distribution with recreational runners, I definitely say no, do not start with high intensity interval training. Start with low, slow, moderate intensity exercise. That's most probably the most beneficial training strategy for this type of population. Yes, this brings me to my last thoughts and maybe future direction. This is a quite busy slide. Actually, the idea came last weekend while skiing in Banff. All of a sudden it popped up and I said, okay, I need to reanalyze my data. And what I did is studies we performed comparing high intensity interval training with high volume, low intensity exercise, or with sorts of mixed forms. I looked at each individual. So every black dot here is the individual with the normal range, maybe human range even, from 25 milliliters up to, we had very good high performing athletes above 80 milliliters of oxygen uptake, and this is the individual response to this type of exercise. And the mean response for high intensity intervals, at least in all of my studies, is about 1.2% increase in VO2 max per week. That's about the average you will have. High volume intensity, you will have about half the increase, and the mixed data seems to fit quite well, is somewhere in between this model. But for me, the most striking part is you have a huge range of subjects here, especially negative responding to the type of exercise or not responding at all. So currently, I would say from the data I presented to you and from my experience, high intensity interval training might be a good solution, but not necessarily in every individual. So there are individuals not reacting. I have maybe some thoughts on why that's the case. I will show you in the next slide. So yeah, and as you can see, there's no correlation. I didn't bother to do correlation analysis if the high performers or those with a high initial VO2 peak, if they react differently. I didn't go into that, but just for me, the information, there are subjects having a huge response, a huge negative response, but a huge positive response as well in all of the groups. So that kind of stimulated me, or stimulates me maybe to proceed with this model I've been creating. And if you look at a 24-hour watch, most probably the training time we invest, at least we know in elite athletes, if we take this 1,000-hour rule per year that's about what cross-country skiers at least can do per year, that will give you about 17% of waking time of exercise time. So 83% of the waking time is not exercise. So you have a lot of time which is not invested into training. So the question is, we focus on trying to define and to implement this type of or to manipulate this time, but actually you have another, if you invest 4 hours, you have another 20 hours of stimuli that definitely will modulate your adaptation. And everything involved here is activities of daily living, inactivity, circadian rhythm, recovery protocols, nutrition, sleep, health, and so on. So there are a lot of modulators. If you use athletes in a free living scenario, and from the seminars I listened to last week and the week before, I love muscle fibers, single muscle fibers. You have basically no confounding factors. You have very small variance, or close to basically no variance, and here we have a lot of variance, and this is just most probably because we cannot control every confounding factor in the free living human. And this is why I've been trying at least to find let's say technologies allowing us to at least identify or to measure, to quantify these modulators, which might probably explain your adaptation coming from the exercise you would like to prescribe. Yeah, my take-home message, there are most probably infinitive amounts of high-intensity protocols depending on the intensity, duration, work-to-rest ratio, type of exercise you want to, muscle groups involved. I definitely say high-intensity interval training is not equal, or not every high-intensity interval protocol is comparable to others. It's not comparable to HIT from strength training. HIIT is currently heavily promoted or investigated, but please do not apply to everyone. I'd say check health status before starting with the subject, and definitely the motivation of the subject. And remember, maybe sometimes the training goal can be achieved actually differently. If we add high intensity to high volume, especially in different populations, there's still an ongoing discussion. It could be maybe 80% high volume exercise to 20% high intensity exercise. We'll see. To me, it's not totally clear in recreational runners. I definitely probably even say maybe it's not even necessary to really distinguish, but based on our data, I would, in recreational runners, I'd always go with the high volume exercise, although it maybe takes more time. And for me, definitely, I would not rely on mean comparisons, mean or standard deviation or classical analysis. I'd go for the non-responder analysis just to see, or more on the individual basis, just to see on how someone reacts to a certain type of exercise. So for me to conclude, when I traveled to Canada, the German Foreign Office actually gave an official travel advisory for everyone traveling to Canada, especially from Germany. Germans in Canada should exercise a high degree of empathy. Be nice. That's what I'm trying. Don't gloat. That's not what I'm doing, I hope. Give hugs. Okay, someone wants to hug. Buy rounds of hot chocolate. And the most important sentence for me is, just imagine how you would feel if Canada beat us in soccer. So please do not beat us in soccer. So who's up for hot chocolate? Thank you for the time. Thank you.
You mentioned early on something about there's a paper, something about mitochondria or something, and then in the 90s it was recommended not to do high-intensity interval training. And I'm just wondering, first of all, did people actually listen to that and pay attention to that? And then was there any performance difference on this?
I don't know where to start on that question. Okay, in Germany, if you do a coaching career, you have different levels you go through. And the basic level you start with, especially that sentence. It's you find it in every textbook related to coaching, and it still is I don't want to say it's a myth, but still a lot of from older coaches, they will tell you, hey, don't do high intensity interval training, it'll kill your mitochondria and your aerobic capacity. And it's I don't know why there's no reference in the book. Most probably at that time someone probably took just a fiber and just dumped it in some solution, and the day after everything was probably the cellular structure was gone. Most probably that was the experiment at that time. And this sentence has been around for such a long time, and I was so glad at that time that international other studies clearly showed that mitochondrial function is not impaired, even vice versa. You have functional adaptation, and it's beginning to change the view. And for coaches, especially if you had a coaching system, that killed all innovation in training science. It was you needed a high amount of high volume exercise. That was the time.
But what did athletes do?
They ran forever, low intensity exercise. It was not, you were not allowed to go above 2 or 3 millimole of lactate, blood lactate. It was like, don't do it. It's kind of like you'll dissolve. It was like, yeah.
Well,
I would have, if I would have done that study 20 years ago, probably some ethical board would have come up and said, hey, you're killing everyone here. Probably that would have happened.
Well, I just wonder whether athletes actually listen to that, because I feel like, just among recreational runners, if you want to be decent at running a 10K, I think for decades it's been understood that intervals are a good idea. Mm-hmm. And I feel like any good runners that I know have always done intervals. And so I would imagine that if, first of all, I'm not sure whether athletes would actually listen to that advice. And then if they did, I'd expect the performance to increase.
Mm-hmm. I think there are two scenarios involved in your statement. For the recreational runners, and sometimes even for, let's say, elite athletes, but not top elite athletes, what they will tend to do is they will tend to move a little bit in zone 2. They will not, they're kind of, especially if they train in groups, it's kind of like they push themselves just a little bit too far in this direction, and sometimes not high enough. And vice versa, recreational runners, I would say most probably are most of the time more in this area. So the view now is a little bit of going more into the poles, so going more into really slow, moderate intensity exercise, but for a long time, and try to hit the high intensity intervals. And currently, at least from the data we have, about probably on a ratio 80 to 20. Yeah, 80 to 20. And in some sports it's 90 to 10, and in some sports it's maybe 70 to 30. But I think there's another issue currently. I think that's more prominent, and I think that's the main issue. Is I think, or I believe, we're not totally fair, especially if we apply research experiments. This is a usual experiment you, as a researcher, you'd like to have. So you'd compare high-intensity interval training with low-intensity continuous exercise, and most probably matched to the energy expenditure. So you would have the same energy expenditure here versus here. So you want to compare apples with apples. It's called isocaloric. But the real-life scenario is actually this. And I believe if we do all the studies comparing high intensity versus high volume exercise, which were performed this way, I'd say if we compare apples and oranges or apples and pears, how real life endurance athletes actually will exercise, I'm pretty sure we will have a little bit of a switch going back to high volume, low intensity exercise. But that's just because reviewers don't like this scenario, they want to have this scenario. Because you want to know the influence of intensity. But actually this is what's going on.
Okay, so I've got a rather big question here that's being asked from the web. It starts off with a statement.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just read each part individually. So the statement starts off and it says almost all research studies are 8 to 12 weeks, but athletes really need to train 8 to 12 years to develop. And so the first part of the question is HIIT sustainable in an athlete for 2 to 3 quadrennials?
Pardon, 2 to 3?
2 to 3 quadrennials, so massive cycles, so 2 or 3 year cycles.
I could not answer that question because we only have retrospective analysis of what athletes do. What I know is if an athlete emphasized more on zone 1 exercise and moves, the older he or she gets, moves a little bit more towards zone 3, you'll see improvements. And most probably it'll be the other way around, and that's just the typical variation you most probably over time would like to see or would like to have. I cannot give you a solution. The polarization models, especially the long term, you cannot plan that long. Biology, you only can plan maybe for 4 to 6 weeks because you never know what happens in between. So that's an answer you only can currently maybe look into if you retrospectively look at what high performers did, and I'm pretty sure you'll find 100 different solutions. And that depends on what they do, not only in training, but also what they do besides training.
So the second part of the question, there's only 3 parts of the question. If HIIT increases mitochondrial biogenesis, stroke volume, etc., why aren't coaches prescribing it for longer term or endurance athletes? Obviously, these adaptations will clearly increase VO2 max.
Mm-hmm. I didn't bring my, did I? Oop. I did not bring, no. My experience is if you, okay, you take athlete, he or she is in a normal training process, and if you want to emphasize kind of like a blocking or you have a more condensed type of exercise, then usually after about 10 to 12 training sessions, the athlete says, hey, so, and you'll have an improvement in about, it depends on the level, but roughly 3 to 7% is the normal increase. And then you have 2 strategies. Either you go to even higher intensity, but shorter, or you go to the zone 1 exercise. This blocking it's under investigation currently. A lot of groups investigate if that's a better solution compared to a 1 day high intensity, next day high volume, high intensity, high volume, or if you have a blocking. Currently, I'd say there's no main difference. But it can be a good solution to have an additional stress to do it as a blocking. But after a certain period of time, you're just fed up with that type of training. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
So, and then I think the third question is right along the question, third part of the question is really in part Art was asking and said, aren't elite swimmers and runners already doing high intensity interval training? Haven't they been kind of employing the strategy since the 40s?
Yes, definitely. They usually have a fairly high amount of high volume exercise, at least from the data I know in runners. If I a little bit look at German data, I'd say currently if I compare our training to others, I'd say we're not close enough having enough zone 3 or high intensity training over time. So the amount of high intensity training is maybe not what we have, and that's most probably what happens to sub-elite athletes. The issue we have currently in analyzing data is this one here. If you take, this is a typical 4-minute interval, 3-minute recovery, 4-minute interval, and so on. And if the question is on how do you want to quantify the amount zone 1 and zone 2, if you take the heart rate as the controlling variable, just have a look here. This actually per definition would be zone 1 exercise, but from your heart rate dynamics, of course heart rate takes a little bit of time until you reach your recovery heart rate. And this part here, or vice versa, this part here is not defined as basically the load we want to have. So currently we're using heart rate analysis to see if someone is in zone 1, zone 2, or zone 3. And I think there's a lot of bias involved in there as well.
Sorry for the wait. Do you know why endurance decreases if you train in that zone 2?
Not totally. There's some thoughts that it's kind of like over time a dysregulation in sympathetic and parasympathetic activation. So it takes a little bit longer to recover. That's a bit the idea behind it. The mechanisms I couldn't tell you, but it's more, actually they're not studies, it's more like thoughts in that area, more related to neural aspects than to more cellular aspects. But it's been linked to impaired recovery, basically. And the intensity is not high enough to improve VO2 max.
And you said you think most recreational runners are in that zone?
Yes.
Can you unpack that a bit more?
If you if you just if you tell someone, a beginner, do your moderate, just run moderately, your easy, steady pace. Most probably, if you look into that person, if you check blood lactate, heart rate, etc., most probably that athlete will end after 10 minutes, 20 minutes, will rather run in zone 2 compared to zone 1 or zone 3. Yeah, it's just they think it's moderate, but they actually gradually increase. Yeah. So this is just my advice. If you work with beginners, based on my data, keep it calm. As long as people can talk, you have normal breathing, or you'll probably be fine. But you can do high intensity as well. The increase is not, or the difference is not. It's not like it's magic, you know. You can start. I personally, I would talk to the person and see what type of person he or she is. If she's more the I need to go full and okay, do high intensity intervals. I know after about 12 sessions they get bored. They need to do something else. Yeah.
I don't know if I saw correctly, but in the first 2 studies that you presented, did the VO2 max change in those kids after the high intensity training? Yes.
In the soccer study, about 7% in the high intensity group. I think 2 or 3% in the high volume. And for the swimmers, it's an issue on how do you measure VO2 max in swimmers. We had, unfortunately, we wanted to go to specialized labs, but we had to test on a bicycle, and the bicycle VO2 max increased in both groups.
Okay. And do you think that the increase that you saw in, say, sprinting times or swimming times were related to VO2 max increase, or was it more related to they got a better technique, muscles got stronger?
Actually, yeah, that's a good question. Actually, the coaches had a different view. They said maybe it's not so much the real changes in cellular or heart dimension. It's just because the kids exercise more closely to their actual competition, or they mimic in every training session, they mimic the competition movement pattern. So I never looked into that, but I could imagine that it's just being more closely, the technique is closer to your competition technique. That could be maybe the mechanism behind it, not so much the physiology. So you have slow, if you do a lot of, it's 60 kilometers of slow intensity exercise, of course you will need some high intensity workout just to mimic the movement pattern of what you will have in that, yeah, definitely.
So a typical periodization would be a low intensity, high volume, and towards competition they would kind of switch to a high intensity, low volume. Where a lot of these studies compare either high or low. Anyone compared, if you do that typical periodization up to competition or a test, if that has the same effect as doing high intensity?
Do that again.
So typically you do a low intensity, high volume, and towards competition
you increase,
switch to
yes.
high intensity.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of the studies look at either purely low or purely high. Have any studies compared if you do that typical periodization, if that has similar effect as the high?
I wouldn't know, but maybe actually I can answer your question with own data. I think this is what you mean. Basically, this is what happens. So this would be the typical way to structure your training plan. This was actually not planned. This should have been down here, this line here for this group here, and this was the polarized. So they had the clear differentiation, and this group didn't. But they automatically, the closer they get to their competition, they increase the amount of high intensity interval training. So most probably we'll never answer that question just because that's not what you do, what coaches will do. And it's very, very difficult to get a group of athletes to do exactly that, what you want to do. Yeah.
I had a discussion a very long time ago with a coach when I was a much younger coach, and there was the aspect of that if you did too much high intensity interval training, or interval training at the time wasn't okay, with a young athlete, but there was a fear that you could increase the thickness of the right or the left ventricle enough that it would prevent the heart from expanding and increasing stroke volume enough as the athlete matured, and you would stick them at some point in time. Mm-hmm. Has there been any kind of discussion about that, or is that just kind of an older way of thinking these days?
Not that I know of. I know a similar discussion is among coaches is they keep this miracle training of high intensity to a certain specific time in their life. It's like they high intensity interval training is implemented a lot later, let's say age of 14, 15, 16, 17, so you have some sort of a benefit, or vice versa. Some coaches think the sooner you implement high intensity interval training, you lose a certain capability of having additional adaptation over time. To be honest, I don't even know one study that would have gone into that, because the studies usually in that area, especially in youth, are never longer than 2 months, maybe maximum 3 months. So that's probably the period. And especially in Germany, our periodization is totally based on school vacation. So they have a lot of time to recover in between, even a lot more than we'd like to have them to, but it is that way. Yeah. No, I cannot answer that question. There's one more thing maybe, and then totally frustrating you maybe. I don't know, this is a study I'm quite interested in. Maybe it's not so much of an issue on zone 1 and zone 3. Maybe it's just an issue on just doing a little bit more. Just not doing 2 sessions per week or 3 sessions, and do not think that much of high intensity or low intensity exercise, but just do more than 3 sessions, go from 3 to 4 to 5 sessions, and that's for beginners. Most probably, I would say, even the better strategy than thinking of high intensity or low intensity exercise. So this is just all non-responders who do not respond within 3 sessions per week. If you add just 1 training session more, all non-responders become responders at the same exercise intensity. So maybe it's not the clue of, in recreational, if this is true in elite athletes, I don't think so, because they're already close to the end of what they're capable time-wise of doing. But in recreational athletes, I'd say just do more, not necessarily within 1 training session, but just do more training sessions. So that's most probably a good strategy.
Thank you. I was wondering, you talked about different sports that you did these studies with, and I was wondering if different sports actually require different things. And the reason I'm saying that is because it seems to happen that, swimmers, some selected swimmers, they can go into the pool twice a day and break 2 world records. And in running, that's impossible. You'll never ever see anybody from 400 to the marathon running 2 races in a day and breaking the world record. Because somehow, when you run a race really hard, your capacity is gone for 2 or 3 days to be able to do that again. Whereas in swimming, you seem to be able to do that. And so I think that there's very different demands in different sports, and I would assume that also to a certain degree dictates on how you do your high intensity interval training.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I'm a little bit shy because I don't know, I'm not biomechanic, I don't know if these calculations are correct, but I think the main story is basically the same. If you take a rower, cyclist, and so on, the main difference is the body weight here, or the body mass is carried, and you have more concentric exercise, and in runners, you have to carry your body mass, and you have a lot of eccentric force. And summing that up, your load, I don't know if this is true per step and so on. In a runner, you probably have megatons per week of load, whereas in a rower or cyclist, the load involvement is a lot lower, meaning that a swimmer, a rower, or a cyclist can do a lot of more high volume exercise compared to a runner. So my message for you is, if you look at high volume exercise in cycling, for example, and the strategies involved in cycling or in running, you most probably, totally agree, you cannot apply to runners, because it's just biomechanically, it's a total different story. And that explains 12 hours of training in running. It's, I call it bone breaking, and basically it is bone breaking. Whereas this athlete here, they can do a lot more high volume exercise.
The other thing that I was wondering, and you didn't really mention it, is kind of a motivation, because I know for high intensity interval training, I did that for many years ago, and you just really needed to be ready for it, because you knew you're going to do 10 times 400, and after the last one you're going to collapse and you're not going to be able to move. And my colleague every time vomited, every time after these workouts. And so you can do that twice a week.
Maybe.
So you haven't talked about that aspect, that the motivation is there. And the other aspect is also that you see, at least in running, I'm not sure in other sports, but in running, you're much more likely to get injured in this high intensity exercise. You don't get injured when you go out for an hour and you do the moderate exercise.
Yeah.
So there's presumably a trade-off as well between injury, motivation, and the training effect.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Motivation is that's why I said it's not appropriate for everyone, and maybe not even for a certain time in your training period. You will have weeks there, most probably you do not want to do high intensity interval training, and then yeah, that's when training science starts. And then how do you modify, how can you get around that issue? And especially if you do it for years, that's a total different story. That's why I say start quite soon, early, with higher intensity, just to get used to this type of intensity. In Germany, high intensity interval training was way at age of 18, 19, 20. A lot later you started with high intensity interval training because it was basically not really allowed. So yeah, motivation is I'd say it's not the limiting factor, but it is an important limiting factor. And the other one is injury, of course. Yeah, totally. I totally agree.
And so the other thing that you mentioned on several occasions, like in the German system, so like if you're a national coach of rowing or cross-country skiing or running, are you actually giving guidelines from a green of what you're allowed to do with your athletes in terms of training?
I don't believe anymore. Not anymore. In the 80s and 90s, it kind of was high intensity. I'd say athletes did high intensity interval training, but it was not, you really didn't discuss about high intensity interval training, especially the amount of high intensity interval training to implement. And the funny part, but that's maybe related to this, you can go into cross-country skiing, the federation, and they discuss maybe 20-80 percentage. Then you go to maybe rowing, then it's 10-90, and then it's 70-30. So I'd say, yes, we know high-intensity interval training is important, but personally, I do not think it's always high intensity. I'd say it's at the end of zone 2, not necessarily zone 3. The athlete feels it's intense, the type of exercise, but it's not high intensity exercise. So they're not in that higher upper zone.
And of course, in terms of soccer, we beat Germany on a regular basis. But just in women's.
That's we'll come back to that issue. Yeah. And soccer, was a very, very strong. That's a good example. In the 90s, it was low volume, long runs, and especially I'd even say soccer was maybe even a driving discipline on that. And it's changed totally. And the good thing is it's now allowed to experiment, which was not really. No one would have done a high intensity interval training 15, 20 years ago. No one.
Well, it's fascinating to see when you watch games 40 years ago from the World Championships, how incredibly slow they are compared to how it's played today. So it's a completely different game.
Yeah.
Right. Last question for Dr. Sperlich. Honest thing.
Well, thank you.
Speaking of Dr. Benjamin Burton, who works with Dr. Nick currently, will explain to us about his findings in the mechanism of osteoarthritis in the thumb joint. See you next week.